All right, welcome back to your daily read aloud. We are reading Frindle. We're about halfway through the book. We know by now that Nick is a clever prankster, and his newest prank, he's made up a new word. He's got the whole school saying it, except one major person who will not say it. Cadence?
Oh, this is
Granger, right? Yeah, she is kind of in a war with him over this word. And he's been talking about it like chess. Like he plays a move, she plays a move, and they're going to see who wins. Who came to Nick's house to talk to his parents? Noah?
It was the principal, but he called it the Black Knight.
Yes, he's calling her the Black Knight.
Black Queen.
Yes, Black Queen. And what did she tell the parents about what he's doing? Emma?
I forget, but the mom was annoyed at the principal.
Yeah.
Because that it wasn't holding anyone.
Yeah, the mom was kind of like, well, I'm on Nick's side. I don't think this is hurting anyone. And the dad was more on the principal's side. So I don't really know how it's going to go. The last time we read, we ended with the principal leaving. So it said the game would go on. Chapter 10, Freedom of the Press. Okay, that is one of our rights as Americans in the Bill of Rights, freedom of press. And what that means is you have the right to print newspapers, you have the right to share news with people, you have the right to make books. So some places you can't write whatever you want and distribute it to people to read. So that is one of our freedoms that maybe we don't even think about, but it's a good one, right? You want to be able to read whatever people write. You don't want someone telling you what you can and can't read. Okay, freedom of the press. Judy Morgan was a reporter for the Westfield Gazette, the local newspaper. Westfield was a quiet little town. There was the occasional burglary. The teenagers got rowdy once in a while, and there was some shouting at the town council or the planning board now and then. But mostly, things were calm and orderly in Westfield, and every Thursday the Westfield Gazette proved it. Ted Bell sold advertisements for the paper, and he had a daughter in 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary. He told Judy that a bunch of 5th graders were making trouble and were not obeying teachers anymore, that there was something about a secret code word that they were all using. And half the students had been kept after school one day last week, including his own little girl. The only other story Judy was working on was about 18 new trees that were going to be planted along East Main Street. The trees could wait. This thing at the elementary school sounded like a real story. So, Judy Morgan, the reporter, showed up at Lincoln Elementary School at 3 o'clock the day after Mrs. Chatham had been to visit Nick's parents. The sign on the door said, "All visitors must report to the office," and she did. On the bulletin board outside the office, Judy saw Mrs. Granger's notice about the punishment for using the word frindle. She stepped back 2 paces, aimed her camera at the notice, and snapped a photo. She read the notice once more, and then she stepped into the office. Mrs. Freed, the school secretary, looked up and smiled. "May I help you?" "Yes, I'm sure you can. My name is Judy Morgan, and I work for the Westfield Gazette. I'd like to know about that poster outside the office, the one about this word, frindle. Who should I talk to?" Mrs. Freed stopped smiling. She was sick and tired of anything to do with that word. For the past week, her phone had been ringing off the hook. What does that mean? Ringing off the hook. Abby?
It's been ringing like so many times.
It's just ringing and ringing and ringing a lot. If it wasn't a parent complaining about a child who had to stay after school, it was someone from the school board trying to get in touch with Mrs. Chatham or Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Freed pursed her lips and narrowed her eyes. She said, "Well, you'll have to speak with the principal. Let me see if Mrs. Chatham is free." She was. There isn't a principal alive who won't find the time to talk to someone from the local newspaper. The reporter was invited into Mrs. Chatham's office. Judy noticed right away that the principal was not comfortable talking about this stuff. When asked about the poster outside the office door, Mrs. Chatham laughed and said, "Oh, that? It's nothing really. Some kids have been playing a prank, and it was time to put a stop to it." The principal's laugh sounded phony to Judy Morgan. "And did that notice put an end to the prank? I heard that a lot of children were kept after school last week. Would you tell me a little about that? Parents would like to know what's going on." Mrs. Chatham looked like a kid who had been sent to the principal's office. She squirmed a little in her chair and tried to smile. She said, "Well, we do still have a little problem, but it's under control. Mrs. Granger may have overreacted a bit. I don't think the children have really been trying to be disrespectful. They are just having some fun, and it's more like a difference of opinion." And then Mrs. Chatham went on to tell the reporter what she knew about the word frindle and how it had become popular among the students. Judy Morgan took careful notes. And when the principal had finished, Judy said, "Would you mind if I asked Mrs. Granger a few questions?" Mrs. Chatham said, "No, not at all." But Judy could tell that the principal wished she would just go away. What could she say, though? Mrs. Chatham couldn't very well keep the reporter away from Mrs. Granger because, after all, America is a free country with a free press. If Judy really wanted to, she would talk to Mrs. Granger sooner or later. It was sooner. In 3 minutes, Judy Morgan was standing at the doorway of room 12, looking in at Mrs. Granger. There were about 15 children sitting at desks scattered around the room, busy writing out one of their 100 sentences. She knocked, and the teacher and students looked up from their work. "I'm Judy Morgan from the Westfield Gazette, Mrs. Granger. May I have a word with you?" Mrs. Granger stood and came out into the hallway and closed the door. Judy could see past her and saw that every kid in the room was straining to listen. Judy noticed Mrs. Granger's eyes right away. Gray, maybe flecked with a little gold, and very sharp, but not hard or mean, just bright and strong. The reporter didn't waste words. "So, I hear that you plan to stop the students from using their new word. How goes the battle?" Mrs. Granger did not smile, and her eyes got even brighter. "First of all, it is not a battle. I am merely helping my students to see that this foolishness should stop. Such a waste of time and thought. There is no reason to invent a new and useless word. They should each learn to use the words we already have. But of course, all of this is just a silly fad. And when you add an E to fad, you get fade. And I predict that this fad will fade." Judy looked up from her notepad and asked, "Any idea how it all got started?" Mrs. Granger's eyes seemed to almost catch on fire at that question, and she said, "Yes, I have a very good idea how it all got started. It was one young man's idea, a 5th grade student named Nicholas Allen. And now you will have to excuse me, Ms. Morgan, for I have papers I must grade." And with a brief, firm handshake, Mrs. Granger ended the interview. The reporter didn't leave right away. She walked back through the hallway and sat on a bench outside the office so she could look over her notes to make sure they made sense. It took her about 5 minutes. All right, sorry about that. I was interrupted by terrible behavior in class. Okay. The reporter didn't leave right away. She walked back through the hallway and sat on a bench outside the office so she could look over her notes to make sure they made sense. It took her about 5 minutes. Then Judy stood up, put her notebook into her large black purse, waved goodbye to a frowning Mrs. Freed, and headed out the door. As she walked to the parking lot, 5 or 6 kids who had just finished writing their sentences for Mrs. Granger came out another door. Judy walked beside them, listening to them laugh and joke. Then she asked them, "Why do you kids keep saying frindle? Don't you hate staying after school?" A boy who was almost falling over from the weight of his backpack looked up at her and smiled. "It's not so bad. There's always a bunch of my friends there. I've written that sentence 600 times now." And then the kids said Mrs. Granger didn't even look at their punishment papers anymore. They were sure, because where you were supposed to write, "I am writing this punishment with a pen," everyone was writing the word frindle every 4th or 5th sentence. And Mrs. Granger hadn't said anything. One girl bragged that she had written the word frindle 45 times on her sheets today. She grinned and said, "That's a new record." "And this boy named Nick?" Judy asked. "Has he had to stay after school too?" The kids giggled, and a tall boy with reddish-brown hair and glasses said, "Mrs. Granger has kept Nick after school so much that everyone thinks she wants to adopt him." The reporter smiled and said, "Do you think I could find Nick and talk to him this afternoon?" The boy looked at Judy for a second and then said, "I don't think Nick would want to talk to you right now. He might say something stupid and get himself in trouble." Then he grinned at his friends. The kids laughed and poked and punched each other and headed off down the block. Judy drove back to her office and started writing. The next morning, a brown envelope arrived at the Gazette offices addressed to Judy Morgan, and below her name was written, Friendle Story. When Judy opened it, there was a class picture, the 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary School. Mrs. Granger and the 6 other teachers were standing at the ends of the rows, and the kids were dressed neatly, hair all combed. But there was something odd about this picture. The reporter looked closely and saw that each kid was holding up a pen, and each little mouth was puckered in the same way. She was puzzled for a second, but then she said softly, "Of course, they're all saying Friendle." Written on the back of the picture in neat cursive was 3rd row, 5th from left. Judy looked at the picture, and there she saw the same grinning, red-haired boy with glasses that she had talked to in the school parking lot yesterday. She chuckled and said, "Well, well, well, pleased to meet you, Mr. Nicholas Allen." So she already met him in the parking lot, but he didn't give himself away. Kind of reminds me of My Side of the Mountain when Sam Gribley pretends that he's not the right kid, but the other guy knew the whole time. All right, Chapter 11, Extra, Extra, read all about it. On Thursday morning, the Westfield Gazette was delivered to all 12,297 homes and post office boxes in Westfield. The story about Lincoln Elementary School was the first item on the front page. And the headline? Local 5th grader says, "Move over, Mr. Webster." Okay, Webster's dictionary is the most popular dictionary. It was quite an article. Not that Judy Morgan didn't tell the truth. Every statement in the article was completely true. It was the peculiar way she told the truth that got things hopping around town. For example, take this sentence about Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger, champion of the forces of order and authority, is battling hundreds of young Friendle fighters. Neither side is giving in. Or this bit about Nick. Everyone agrees that Nick Allen masterminded this plot that cleverly raises issues about free speech and academic rules. He is the boy who invented the new word. Or this last sentence in the article. One thing is sure. The kids at Lincoln Elementary School love their Friendles, and no one seems to be backing off in this war of the words. And of course, the Westfield Gazette published the class picture too, and Mrs. Granger and Nick were identified for all the world to see. What is the meaning of this? That's what Nick's mother said, putting the article in front of Nick's nose when he got home from school. Did you talk to this reporter? She seems to know an awful lot about you and your word, young man. What is the meaning of this? That's what the school superintendent said to Mrs. Chatham, slapping a copy of the article onto her desk. Why did you have to talk to that reporter? Don't we have enough trouble getting the taxpayers to pay for the schools without articles like this banging around town? What is the meaning of this? That's what Mrs. Chatham said to Mrs. Granger, shaking the newspaper in front of her face. I know you had to talk to that woman, but did you have to say all these things? It'll be a wonder if we all don't get fired. It was quite a Thursday for everyone, and no one could figure out how Judy Morgan had gotten that 5th grade class picture. All right, any predictions? How did she get that? Someone sent it to her. What do you think, Cadence?
Oh, someone sent it to her from like...
All right, Josiah, any idea who?
Nick.
You think Nick? Noah?
Random student.
Random student. Madeline?
Same as Josiah.
Okay, Nick. Dylan? Okay, Hayden?
Principal.
You think the principal sent it? Okay. Emma?
Nick said because on the back it said 5th to the left.
Yeah, it said right where he was. Okay. Angie?
I think so that photographer that was taking the school photo.
Okay, maybe they did it.
Because she's a news reporter and the photographer is kind of like that.
Okay, so maybe a photographer for the paper sent it on over. All right. We have time for, well, let me see how long our next chapter is before I start reading. Ooh, it's long. I'll read part of it. Chapter 12, Airwaves. Within a week after the article was published in the Westfield Gazette, the kids at the junior high and the kids at the high school had stopped using the word pen and had started using the word Friendle. They loved it. Nick became sort of a hero for kids all over town, and he quickly learned that being a hero, even if you're only a local hero, isn't a free ride. It has a price. People noticed Nick when he walked into his dad's hardware store or when he stood in line at the penny pantry to buy a candy bar. He could feel it when someone recognized him, and it made him shy and awkward. Kids at school started expecting him to be clever and funny all the time, and even for a kid as smart as Nick, that was asking a lot. Every teacher, the office secretary, the principal, even the school nurse and the custodian, all seemed to be watching, always watching. His parents were great about everything. True, his mom had been upset when the article first came out, and so had his dad. Nick had said, "But I didn't do anything wrong, Mom, and neither did that lady from the newspaper." And his parents could see that he was right. The things in the article were true, and the truth is the truth, and nothing could be done about it now. Even though it made them uncomfortable to have their boy talked about all over town, secretly, Nick's mom and dad were pleased. After all, a brand new word is a pretty amazing thing. Their Nicholas was quite a fellow, no getting around that. Someone else in town thought this brand new word was pretty amazing too. Bud Lawrence had lived all his life in Westfield, and when he was only 19 years old, he had saved enough money to make an investment. He looked around for a good idea and then bought the first Dairy Queen in the state. After a few years, he bought a McDonald's restaurant. That was almost 30 years ago. And these two restaurants had made him rich, one of Westfield's leading citizens. When Bud Lawrence saw the article about the new word, he had his lawyer file a preliminary trademark claim on the word friendle. Within 4 days, he had set up a small company that was selling cheap plastic ballpoint pens, specially imprinted with the word friendle. He sold 3,000 friendles the first week, and they sold so fast that stores all over Westfield couldn't keep them in stock. Then just as quickly, kids stopped asking for friendles. The sales slowed down and Bud Lawrence started thinking about other projects. A week later, it was Halloween. The leaves started falling, and it seemed like the town was going to quiet down. And it would have, if it hadn't been for Alice Lunderson. Alice lived in Betherly, a town 7 miles away from Westfield, and she worked part-time for the local CBS TV station in Carrington, a town of about 75,500 people. When there was important area news, disasters like floods or tornadoes, or sometimes if she came across little stories that seemed cute or original, Alice would call the station news manager in Carrington. If it was a good story, or if it was a day when not much else was happening in the world, then the TV station would send out a van and a camera crew to shoot some videotape. Alice subscribed to all the small-town newspapers in the area to keep up with local events. Most of them were published on Thursday, and they arrived at her house by Monday or Tuesday. Then it took her a day or so to look through them all. But on Wednesday morning, she finally saw the article in the Westfield Gazette about the word war. She read it through twice and looked carefully at the class photograph. She was sure that this story was a winner. The TV station manager in Carrington agreed with her. He called the CBS station in Boston because sometimes Boston picked up stories from the Carrington newsroom. The woman in Boston thought the story had some real zip to it, so she called the network news editor in New York. When the facts of the Westfield Gazette article got to New York, the staff there loved it. They looked over the schedule sheet for the week and decided it would be the perfect closing story for the CBS Evening News for the next day on Thursday. All right, so the CBS Evening News would be the news that is played all across the country. The best time where most people that watch the news, that's when they're going to watch it. So it's a big news story. Orders flew back through the telephone links from New York to Boston to Carrington to Betherly. By Wednesday at noon, Alice had a go order to take the story all the way. It was her first piece to get onto the national news, and 20 million viewers would see it. Alice Lunderson and her camera crew stood on Mrs. Granger's front porch Wednesday after school. Mrs. Granger was not impressed by all the lights and the microphones. She looked right into the camera and said, "I have always said that the dictionary is the finest tool ever made for educating young minds, and I still say that. Children need to understand that there are rules about words and language, and that those rules have a history that makes sense. And to pretend that a perfectly good English word can be replaced by a silly made-up word just for the fun of it? Well, it's not something I was ready to stand by and watch without a fight." "And have you lost that fight, Mrs. Granger?" asked the reporter. Mrs. Granger turned her eyes up to nearly full power as she looked into the camera, and with a pale smile, she said, "It's not over yet." Madeline?
I think they're going to at some point put Frindle in the dictionary.
I hope so. When Alice and the crew showed up at Nick's house, the Allen family was ready for them. Mom and Dad sat on the couch with Nick between them. Nick squinted into the lights. His mom had worked out with Nick what he could say and what he couldn't say. "You remember, young man," she had told him as she combed his hair, "these reporters are just looking for a quick story that'll make some excitement. But you have to stay here and live in this town, so mind your P's and Q's." As they sat there on the couch, Mrs. Allen had her foot on top of Nick's under the coffee table, and if she pushed down, it meant that the reporter had just asked a question that she was going to answer for him. Mrs. Allen did not trust reporters. "So tell me, Nick, why did you make up this new word, frindle?" asked Alice Lunderson. Nick gulped and said, "Well, my teacher, Mrs. Granger, said that all the words in the dictionary were made up by people and that they meant what they mean because we say they do. So I thought it would be fun to just make up a new word and see if that was true." "And were you surprised when Mrs. Granger got mad about that?" asked Alice with a smile. There was a push on Nick's foot, and his mother said, "We never felt that Mrs. Granger got angry. When everyone started using the word frindle, it just got to be a disruption, that's all. She really is a very fine teacher." "Yeah," said Nick. "I mean, I learned a lot about words, and without her I wouldn't have." "So what's next for you in the new word?" Alice was wrapping up. She could see that Nick and his parents were not going to be pushed into saying anything controversial. So she just kept it light and happy. "Well," said Nick, "the funny thing is, even though I invented it, it's not my word anymore. Frindle belongs to everyone now, and I guess everyone will figure out what happens together." Alice also had a short chat with a worried Alice also had a short chat with a worried-looking Mrs. Chatham and a smiling Bud Lawrence, maker of the official frindle. Then she shot her opening bit and her closing bit, and the camera crew drove back to Carrington to edit all the pieces, put them together into a 2-minute news story. The next night, when all the serious news about wars and oil prices and world food supplies had been talked about on the CBS Evening News, the anchorman looked into the camera and smiled. He said, "It is believed by many that the word quiz was made up in 1791 by a Dublin theater manager named Dolly. He had bet someone that he could invent a brand new word in the English language, and he chalked up the letters Q-U-I-Z onto every wall and building in town. The next morning, there it was, and within a week, people all over Ireland were wondering what it could mean. And a new word had been created. Quiz is the only word in English that was invented by one person for no particular reason. That is, until now. Now there is a new word, frindle, and here is Alice Lunderson in Westfield, New Hampshire with the story." Alice came on screen with a short introduction. Then, right there on TV, Mrs. Granger and Nick and Bud Lawrence and Nick's mom were talking to 20 million people about frindles. One of those 20 million people was a producer for The Late Show with David Letterman. All right, he used to be a late-night talk show host. He's been retired for a while, so you might not know who he is. But he is a very famous man. And another one of those 20 million people was a staff writer for People magazine. And another one was a writer for 321 Contact magazine for kids. Dozens of other writers and producers and marketing people saw that story on the news, and all of them smelled a great story. During the next 3 weeks, every man, woman, and child in America heard about this funny new word that kids were using instead of the word pen. And kids in Ohio and Iowa and New York and Texas and California started using it too. Bud Lawrence was suddenly flooded with orders for anything with the word frindle on it, and he quickly got interested again. But there were complications. Bud's lawyer said, "You see that stack of orders there? Trouble. That's what that is. We got a trademark file, but it's only like an application. The whole country knows that that little kid made up the word, and unless you make a deal with his dad, you're going to end up with nothing, maybe even a big fat lawsuit. That kid owns that word." When Mr. Allen came home at lunchtime, his wife told him that he had to call Bud Lawrence. It's something about the new word. This was not good news to Tom Allen. He was sick and tired of all the fuss, and being away from the hardware store so much while all this nonsense was happening had put him weeks behind on his paperwork. He'd be lucky now to get his Christmas order in time. Even though he didn't really want anything to do with it, Bud was an old friend. So on the way back to the store, Nick's dad went to see Bud Lawrence at his office. All right, we will stop there today. But I want to know, do you think if Bud Lawrence offers Nick's dad money from the sale of all these Frindle items, raise your hand if you think yes, he will accept the money. A couple people. Raise your hand if you think he'll say no, I don't want it. All right, friends at home, way more people said no than yes. We will find out. See you tomorrow.